The impossible declaration. The autumn wind carried fallen leaves across the cemetery as mourners gathered around the closed casket. 7-year-old Ethan Parker stood quietly beside his mother Rachel, his small hand clutched tightly in hers. The priest's words echoed through the crisp morning air, speaking of loss and remembrance for Thomas Parker, beloved husband and father. Detective Marcus Hayes watched from the back of the crowd, his weathered face betraying little emotion. He had known Thomas through their shared love of weekend fishing trips, though they hadn't spoken much in recent months. Something about this funeral felt wrong, the rushed arrangements, the closed casket, the way Rachel's eyes darted nervously around the gathering. As the priest finished his eulogy, Ethan suddenly pulled away from his mother's grasp. "Wait," his clear voice rang out across the cemetery. "My daddy isn't dead. I saw him yesterday." A hushed murmur rippled through the crowd. Rachel quickly pulled Ethan close, whispering urgent words into his ear, but the boy remained adamant. "He was at the playground watching me after school," Ethan continued, his voice unwavering. "He had on his blue jacket and everything." Detective Hayes straightened, his instincts suddenly alert. Thomas had indeed owned a distinctive blue jacket, it was his favorite. Rachel's face had gone pale, and she was now practically dragging Ethan away from the casket. "I'm so sorry," she muttered to the gathered mourners. "He's having trouble accepting, this is all very hard for him." But Hayes noticed something else, the slight tremor in Rachel's hands, the way she wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. 20 years of police work had taught him to recognize fear when he saw it. After the service, Hayes approached the cemetery office, flashing his badge. "I'd like to see the death certificate for Thomas Parker," he said to the clerk. The woman typed at her computer, frowning. "That's strange," she said. "I'm not finding any record of it in our system." Hayes's suspicion deepened. He drove to the city records office, but met similar resistance. The death certificate seemed to exist only as a reference number, no actual document could be located. That evening, Hayes sat in his home office, spreading out old photos of fishing trips with Thomas. His friend had worked as an IT security consultant, often traveling for work. But in the months before his death, Thomas had seemed distracted, worried even. Hayes had assumed it was just work stress. A knock at his door startled him. Opening it, he found Ethan standing there alone, out of breath from running. "Detective Hayes," the boy gasped. "I needed to tell you something else about my dad. Something I couldn't say at the funeral." Hayes quickly invited him in, noting the darkening sky. "Does your mother know you're here?" Ethan shook his head. "She won't listen to me. But I know what I saw. And there's more, Dad left me a message." Hayes leaned forward. "What kind of message?" "In my video game. The one he bought me for my birthday last month. When I turned it on yesterday, there was a new save file. The character's name was Tom Park, that's what Mom always calls him. And the only item in the inventory was a key." Hayes felt a chill run down his spine. "A key to what?" "I don't know," Ethan replied. "But every time I try to tell Mom about it, she gets scared and changes the subject. Something's wrong, isn't it? With how Dad died?" Hayes studied the boy's face, there was no hint of confusion or uncertainty there, only determination. He thought about the missing death certificate, Rachel's nervous behavior, and now this strange message in a video game. "I think you might be right, Ethan," Hayes said carefully. "And I promise you, we're going to figure out what's really going on." A car door slammed outside, and Ethan jumped. "That's probably Mom looking for me. I have to go." He hurried to the door, then paused. "Detective Hayes? Please help find my dad. I know he's out there." As Hayes watched Ethan disappear into the growing darkness, he made a silent vow to uncover the truth, wherever it might lead. Thomas Parker's death had too many loose ends, too many unanswered questions. And somewhere in the shadows, Hayes suspected, a father was indeed watching over his son, forced into hiding by circumstances yet unknown. The detective turned back to his desk, pulling out a fresh notepad. Something big was happening, something that had forced a man to fake his own death and abandon his family. Hayes had no idea how deep this rabbit hole would go, but he knew one thing for certain: a 7-year-old boy's impossible declaration at a funeral was just the beginning. Traces in the shadows. The cool morning air clung to Detective Hayes as he sat in his car outside Ethan's school, watching the playground where the boy claimed to have seen his father. He'd spent the last week gathering fragments of information, security camera footage, phone records, anything that might shed light on Thomas Parker's supposed death. A tap on his window startled him. It was Janet Wheeler, Ethan's teacher, her face etched with concern. Hayes stepped out to speak with her. "Detective, I needed to tell you something about Ethan," she said, glancing around nervously. "Yesterday during art class, he drew something unusual." She handed Hayes a child's drawing, crude but clear enough. It showed a man in a blue jacket standing behind a tree, holding what appeared to be a phone. In the corner, Ethan had written, "Dad's secret." "That's not all," Janet continued. "Last week, I caught him trying to access the school's computer lab during recess. When I asked why, he said he needed to check his father's email." Hayes frowned. His father's email? Did he manage to get in? No, but he seemed very certain about the password he was trying to use. Something about his birthday and a special word. Back at his desk, Hayes dug deeper into Thomas's work history. His IT security consulting seemed legitimate enough, but there were gaps, weeks where his billing records simply vanished. The company he worked for, Nexus Solutions, had an oddly sparse online presence for a supposedly major contractor. A call from Rachel interrupted his research. "Detective, please stop encouraging my son's fantasies," she said, her voice tight with stress. "It's only making things harder. Rachel, there are too many inconsistencies here. The missing death certificate, Thomas's work history dash." "I can't talk about this," she cut him off. "Just, please leave us alone." The line went dead. Later that afternoon, Hayes received an unexpected visitor at the precinct, Benjamin Foster, Thomas's former supervisor at Nexus Solutions. The man's expensive suit and carefully neutral expression set off warning bells in Hayes's mind. "I understand you've been asking questions about Thomas Parker," Foster said smoothly. "I wanted to assure you that his death, while tragic, was thoroughly documented. Perhaps I could share some details over coffee?" They sat in a nearby diner, but Foster's details were frustratingly vague. What caught Hayes's attention was how the man kept checking his phone, seemingly more interested in Hayes's reactions than the conversation itself. As Foster left, Hayes noticed something had been slipped under his coffee cup, a small note reading, "Storage Unit 247, Central Lock and Key. Hurry." The storage facility was on the outskirts of town. Unit 247's lock had been recently cut, the door slightly ajar. Inside, Hayes found only one item, a laptop, its screen cracked but still functional. When he powered it on, a video file automatically played. Thomas Parker's face filled the screen, looking tired but very much alive. The timestamp showed it was recorded just 3 days ago. "Marcus, if you're watching this, it means Ethan found my message. I'm sorry for the deception, but I had no choice. What I discovered at Nexus, it goes deeper than anyone realizes. They're using the security contracts as cover for something much darker. I had to disappear to protect my family, but I've been collecting evidence. Rachel doesn't know the full truth, it's safer that way. But Ethan, that boy sees more than anyone realizes." The video cut off abruptly. Hayes sat back, his mind racing. A new text message lit up his phone, "An unknown number, behind you." Hayes spun around, but the storage unit's narrow corridor was empty. Yet when he returned to his car, he found a blue jacket, Thomas's jacket, folded neatly on the passenger seat. In its pocket was a USB drive and another note: "Trust no one. Especially not Foster. Keep Ethan safe." As Hayes drove home, his rearview mirror showed a black SUV following at a discreet distance. The game was changing. What started as a child's declaration at a funeral was evolving into something far more dangerous. And somewhere in the shadows, Thomas Parker was orchestrating an elaborate plan, using his son's unwavering faith as a beacon to guide the truth into light. Hayes gripped the steering wheel tighter, knowing that every move from this point forward could have life-or-death consequences. The evidence of Thomas's survival was mounting, but so were the signs that powerful people wanted him to stay dead. The real question now was, who could be trusted? The detective glanced at the blue jacket beside him, remembering Ethan's words at the funeral. The boy hadn't been delusional after all, he'd been the only one brave enough to speak the truth. And now, that truth was casting dangerous shadows across them all. Web of secrets. Detective Hayes stared at the contents of the USB drive glowing on his laptop screen. Files upon files of internal Nexus Solutions documents scrolled past, financial records, encrypted communications, and project codenames that hinted at operations far beyond simple IT security consulting. One name kept appearing: Project Blacklight. Hayes downloaded the associated files just as his screen suddenly went black. When it rebooted, everything was gone, except for a single image file. Opening it revealed a grainy security camera photo of Thomas Parker entering a bank 2 days ago. His phone buzzed. Ethan was calling from a number he didn't recognize. "Detective Hayes," the boy whispered urgently. "I found something in Mom's office. She has a secret phone, and I saw Dad's name in the messages." "Ethan, where's your mother now?" "She's talking to the men in suits downstairs. They come every night now, but she thinks I'm sleeping." Hayes felt his pulse quicken. "Listen carefully. Don't let them know you saw anything. I'm on my way." As he drove, Hayes called in a favor from his old friend at the FBI, Agent Diana Reynolds. "Diana, I need everything you have on Nexus Solutions and Project Blacklight. And I mean everything." "Marcus," her voice was tense, "that's highly classified. How do you even know those names?" "Because a man faked his death to expose them, and now his 7-year-old son is in danger." "Silence, then, check your secure email in an hour." "And Marcus? Watch your back." When Hayes arrived at the Parker house, the black SUVs were already pulling away. Rachel met him at the door, her face pale but composed. "You shouldn't be here." "Who were they, Rachel? What does Nexus really want?" She glanced upstairs toward Ethan's room, then stepped outside, closing the door behind her. "Thomas discovered something he shouldn't have. They were going to kill him, Detective. The funeral, it was the only way to buy time." "Time for what?" "To get the proof out. Thomas built a backdoor into their system, but he needed to stay dead until he could access it safely. Those men, they watch us constantly, waiting for him to make contact." A soft thud from inside the house made them both freeze. Hayes drew his weapon, but Rachel grabbed his arm. "No. If they think we're onto them, dash." The sound of breaking glass upstairs shattered the night. They rushed inside to find Ethan's room empty, his window broken. On his bed lay Thomas's blue jacket, the same one Hayes had found in his car, now with a bloody handprint on the sleeve. Rachel collapsed against the wall, pulling out the secret phone Ethan had mentioned. "Thomas, they took him. They took our son." Hayes' secure phone buzzed. Diana's promised intel had arrived. His eyes widened as he read, "Project Blacklight, unauthorized surveillance program. Nexus Solutions suspected of selling classified data to foreign entities. Primary whistleblower, Thomas Parker." "Rachel," Hayes said urgently, "where would Thomas go if he needed a safe place?" Somewhere from before, somewhere only your family would know about? Her eyes lit up with sudden understanding. The cabin. His grandfather's old hunting cabin. We spent every summer there before Ethan was born. Send him a message. Tell him they have Ethan. If he's watching like we think he is dash. A new text appeared on Rachel's phone, Lake Road. 1 hour. Come alone. He's had an escape plan all along, Rachel whispered. He knew they might take Ethan. Hayes checked his weapon. You won't be alone. I'll follow at a distance. But Rachel, are you ready for this to end? One way or another. She stood straighter, a mother's fierce determination replacing her fear. They took my son. They forced my husband into hiding. I'm done being afraid. As they drove toward the lake, Hayes thought about Ethan's unwavering belief in his father, how a child's simple truth had begun unraveling an entire conspiracy. Now that same boy's life hung in the balance, along with the explosive evidence his father had risked everything to expose. The lake road stretched ahead, dark and winding. Somewhere in the shadows, Thomas Parker was preparing for a final confrontation. And this time, Hayes realized, it wasn't just about exposing the truth, it was about keeping a family alive long enough to be reunited. Thunder rumbled in the distance as storm clouds gathered overhead. The web of secrets was about to break, one way or another. The only question was, who would survive when it did? The chase for truth. The lake road twisted through dense forest, rain now falling in heavy sheets. Hayes maintained his distance from Rachel's car, headlights off, watching for any signs of pursuit. His phone buzzed with a message from Agent Reynolds, FBI teams en route. Nexus leadership in custody. Hold position. But Hayes knew they couldn't wait. Somewhere ahead, Ethan was being held by desperate people who'd just lost everything. His dashcam caught a flash of movement, another vehicle paralleling the road through the trees, running dark. Rachel's car suddenly accelerated, then veered onto a nearly invisible dirt track. Hayes followed, his tires struggling for grip on the muddy surface. The track ended at a small clearing where Rachel was already out of her car, running toward a weathered cabin barely visible through the rain. Rachel, wait! Hayes called out, but his voice was drowned by a massive thunderclap. A figure emerged from the cabin, Thomas Parker, holding Ethan's hand. The boy broke free and ran toward his mother, but another shadow detached itself from the darkness. Benjamin Foster stepped into view, his expensive suit now sodden, a gun trained on the family. Nobody move, Foster said, his corporate smoothness gone. Parker, the encryption key. Now. Or your touching reunion ends here. Hayes crouched behind his car, weapon drawn, looking for a clear shot. But Foster kept the family between them, using them as shields. It's over, Ben, Thomas said calmly. The FBI has everything. Blacklight, the data sales, all of it. Let them go. Everything? Foster laughed harshly. You only saw what we wanted you to see. Blacklight was just the surface. The real project, well, let's just say certain governments pay very well for what we've built. A branch cracked in the forest. Foster spun toward the sound, and Hayes saw his chance. He fired once, the shot catching Foster in the shoulder. The man stumbled but didn't fall, returning fire wildly. Rachel grabbed Ethan and Dove behind Thomas's car as Hayes rushed forward. Thomas tackled Foster, both men going down in the mud. The gun skittered away into the darkness. Run! Thomas shouted to his family. The other cabin. Go! Hayes reached the struggling men just as Foster landed a heavy blow to Thomas's head. The detective pulled Foster back, but the man was surprisingly strong, fighting with the desperation of someone who knew his world was collapsing. Through the rain, Hayes saw Rachel and Ethan running toward a second, smaller cabin deeper in the woods. Thomas staggered to his feet, blood mixing with rain on his face. Foster broke free from Hayes and sprinted after the family. Thomas and Hayes pursued, their feet slipping on the wet ground. The storm intensified, lightning illuminating the scene in stark flashes. They reached the second cabin just as Foster caught up to Rachel and Ethan at the door. But instead of fear, Rachel's face showed grim satisfaction as she pushed Ethan behind her. "You didn't really think we'd come without a plan, did you?" she said. The cabin door burst open, revealing Agent Reynolds and a team of FBI agents, weapons raised. "Benjamin Foster," Reynolds announced, "you're under arrest for espionage, conspiracy, and about 24 other charges we're still cataloging." As Foster was taken into custody, Ethan finally ran to his father, throwing himself into Thomas's arms. Rachel joined them, the family clinging to each other as the storm began to ease. Hayes watched the reunion, holstering his weapon. Reynolds approached him, looking pleased. The evidence Thomas collected was just the start. "Foster's phone has everything, contacts, accounts, the whole network. This goes higher than anyone imagined." "What about Thomas?" Hayes asked. "He technically broke several laws himself." Reynolds smiled. "Let's just say his cooperation has earned him some consideration. Witness protection might need an overhaul though, seems their protocols aren't kid-proof." Hayes glanced at Ethan, who was excitedly telling his father about everything he'd noticed, every clue he'd gathered. The boy's certainty had never wavered, even when every adult around him insisted he was wrong. Thomas caught Hayes's eye and mouthed a silent "thank you." The detective nodded, knowing that sometimes the most incredible truths come from those most people refuse to believe. As dawn broke over the lake, Hayes watched the Parker family heading toward a waiting FBI vehicle, together at last. Sometimes, he reflected, a child's impossible declaration at a funeral could spark a chain of events that exposed corruption, toppled conspiracies, and most importantly, brought a family back together. A father's return. 6 months after the stormy night at the lake, Detective Hayes sat across from the Parker family in their new home, hundreds of miles from where their story began. The house was modest but warm, filled with the kind of comfortable chaos that comes with a family finally able to live without fear. The last of Foster's network was arrested yesterday, Hayes informed them, accepting a cup of coffee from Rachel. The evidence Thomas collected led to indictments all the way up to the board of directors. Nexus Solutions is finished. Thomas, looking healthier than Hayes had ever seen him, nodded in satisfaction. And the classified data they stole? Contained and secured. Your backdoor program helped the FBI track every copy, every buyer. Agent Reynolds says your code was brilliant, by the way. Ethan, who had been quietly drawing at the kitchen table, brought his latest artwork to show. It was a detailed picture of their family, standing together under a bright sun, no more shadows, no more hiding. "I knew Dad would come back," Ethan said simply, climbing onto his father's lap. "I saw him watching over us, even when nobody believed me." Rachel squeezed her son's shoulder. "You never gave up, did you? Even when I tried to convince you otherwise." "A child's faith can be quite powerful," Hayes observed. "Sometimes they see truth more clearly than we do, without all our adult complications getting in the way." Thomas hugged his son closer. "I could only watch from a distance, gathering evidence while Foster's people watched the house. But Ethan, somehow he always knew when I was near. It was like we had a connection they couldn't break." "The video game message was clever," Hayes commented. "How did you know he'd find it?" Thomas smiled. Every Saturday morning, Ethan would play that game before breakfast. Some routines are sacred to a 7-year-old. I knew once he saw the save file name, he'd understand. "And now?" Hayes asked, looking around at their new life. Rachel gestured to a stack of boxes in the corner. "Thomas starts his new cybersecurity consulting job next week, legitimate this time. I'm opening a small therapy practice." And Ethan.